Hey everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Maple Syrup News, where we look at some of the biggest news hitting the gaming industry and more specifically, those affecting the Nintendo Switch. Now in today's edition, we're going to be covering a lot of stories, but I would say that the two biggest ones we're going to be covering is Pokemon Arceus that is already topping some sales charts, as well as the Indie Live Expo that has finally been confirmed to be coming in the month of May. But we're also going to be looking at a couple of new games that have once again been announced to be coming to the Nintendo Switch, and these titles have me very excited. However, we're also going to be looking at 3 games that released last week that I do think still deserve a little bit of attention. And lastly, we're going to be looking at a couple of stories that are hitting the gaming industry with a slightly more negative vibe, one about a YouTube takedown, and finally another one about a company that is unfortunately getting out of a complete part of the industry. So with all that stuff to cover, let's jump straight into those stories. Just remember that if you are liking the content, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Now don't forget, as we get started, if you want any more information on any of these stories, all the links and sources are going to be down below in the description of the video. And we're going to start with one of the games that is announced, and it is actually coming out very soon on February 10th. That is Power Slave Exhumed. Now this is actually a ground-up remaster of a classic 90s FPS game. I'm going to tell you what really shocked me and took me by surprise is how much work was done on the visuals. This isn't a simple port or a simple remaster, it is actually almost a ground-up remake and the visuals look great. Now the trailer that's playing right now is actually showing you comparisons between the original PS1 graphics and the graphics that have been remastered. And we already know that this team can deliver on their promises because this is the same team that handled the Shadow Man remaster that we just received on the Nintendo Switch a couple of weeks ago. So if you're a fan of retro-style shooters, I would keep my eyes open for reviews of this one that should be coming mid-next week. Now the second game that was announced for the Nintendo Switch coming in summer 2022 is going to be KO the Kangaroo. Now this game is a 3D platformer and the franchise has its origins actually on the Sega Dreamcast. Now from what we can tell from the trailer, once again this game is looking really good, right in line with something expected from the Crash Bandicoot series. And if we look at how the Switch actually handled the latest entry, Crash 4, you know what, I have high hopes that KO the Kangaroo can be released on the Nintendo Switch, deliver amazing graphics, and nonetheless run very well. Luckily, we don't have to wait too long, and in these summer months, we should be getting a crack at KO the Kangaroo. Now next, I actually wanted to cover 3 games that released last week that I think a lot of people might have missed just because of all the hype surrounding the new Pokemon game. And it's always rougher for those indie franchises to stand out when you're releasing at the same time as such a huge game. Now the first game that released last week that I think you should put some attention on is Kojin Sword of Rewind. I actually talked about this game a little bit in my latest physical deals and imports video because you can pick up a physical copy from PlayAsia. But it is basically a great 2D action platformer that has some very interesting rewind mechanics and will probably really satisfy fans of the Mega Man X series or even more recently the Gunvolt series. And while we're on the topic of the Gunvolt series, I also want to mention that Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger IX2 actually released last week as well. And once again, I would say this is another very solid release for the series. So once again, 2D action platformer fans, if you're looking for new games to dive into, if you're done with the latest Pokemon game, don't miss out on these 2 great releases. And once again, they're both available on PlayAsia with physical editions. And the last game that released last week as well that I wanted to take a look at is Record of Lodoss War Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth. Now I know the title is quite a mouthful, but trust me, if you're a fan of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, this can be a great pickup for you. It is a great Metroidvania with a truly beautiful art style. There is, however, one tiny thing I would warn about this game. Although it emulates the gameplay style of Symphony of the Night very well, it is quite a bit shorter. But nonetheless, I had tons of fun with this game, and you can once again pick up a physical copy on PlayAsia. I'll be linking all those down below. Now, before moving on to the bigger stories, I do want to put a little bit of attention on 2 of the sadder stories that happened in the gaming world. And the first one of these 2 stories is actually Nintendo that did a copyright takedown of 1,300 soundtracks from Gilva Sunners, which is a very well-known YouTube channel. Now, we're not going to spend too much time talking about this because it remains that this is Nintendo's property, and yes, they do have the rights to ask that these songs be taken down. However, where I find that this story is a little bit sadder is that these are soundtracks that Nintendo do not offer in any monetized form. You don't have a way to listen to these soundtracks or even buy them from Nintendo themselves. And at the same time, Gilva Sunners was not actually monetizing any of these soundtracks. So this wasn't someone trying to make free money off of Nintendo's IPs, it was rather someone trying to fill the void of a service that currently Nintendo simply doesn't offer. And the saddest thing in all this is I think that the biggest losers are actually the fans here, who are actually using this YouTube channel to listen to these awesome soundtracks. But nonetheless, maybe Nintendo has some plans to do something with these soundtracks. We'll see where this brings us in the future. And the other story I wanted to cover that once again had a sadder connotation is the fact that Sega has finally completely left the arcade business and sold the last of their shares to Gaigo. Now, for a lot of people, especially in Japan, this is the end of an era where Sega was present operating Sega arcades for almost 30 years. Now, once again, although I think that this story is very sad, the good news or the light at the end of the tunnel, however, is that Gaigo still plans to operate these arcades only under a new branding. But also, a lot of people thought that this meant that it was the end of Sega arcade machines. But what's important to note is that the division that Sega sold off is only the division that operates the arcade physical locations. The actual division that creates and markets the different arcade machines is a different division that Sega still owns. So we still might see some Sega arcade machines see the light of day. But nonetheless, I think when that last banner goes down on the last arcade location, it's going to be a sad moment for the industry. Okay, now with that stuff out of the way, let's end on a more positive note. And our two biggest stories for today is number one, the Indie Live Expo has finally been confirmed for May 21st and 22nd. Now, the good news here is that the Expo is going to be extended to 2 different days. And not only that, but the organizers of the event have finally listened to fans and they've separated the days into 2 different categories of games. Now, day 1 will be offering games that are currently playable for fans. So it'll be shadow drops mostly, or games that are already out that are trying to get a little bit more recognition. While day 2 of the event will actually be reserved for reveals for new games, also updates on games that have already been announced, and also some live performances. So now that the Indie Live Expo is finally officially confirmed, we have the dates, we have the format, I can guarantee you I'll be making space in my calendar to be covering that event so that we know about all the best indie games coming to the Nintendo Switch. Now, last for today in our stories that we're going to cover is obviously we have Pokemon Legends Arceus that is already topping some sales charts. Now, specifically the ones that have been released are sales charts in the UK, but undoubtedly it's going to be a similar showing in other regions when we finally get the numbers. Now, thanks to GameIndustry.biz, we have this chart here showing you that right now Pokemon Arceus has already skyrocketed to the #1 selling game in the UK. Now, that is not surprising on its own. I think pretty much everyone was expecting that to be the case. But what I think is truly crazy here is that Pokemon on its own has actually accounted for 50% of all boxed games sold last week. Basically, Pokemon on its own has sold as many games as every other boxed game combined together. Now that is actually pretty crazy. And that isn't even the whole story, because this is physical sales only, because currently Nintendo does not divulge online sales. Now they also showed that this was the 4th biggest release for a Pokemon game in the UK, but since the industry is tending more and more towards digital downloads, you know what? If we would combine both sales together, we might just have the biggest release of a Pokemon game ever. Unfortunately, we probably will never get access to those full numbers, but one thing is definitely sure, this game is taking Switch owners by storm, and we just might have one of the biggest selling games of 2022 already releasing in the month of January. Now, I really think this is going to be lining up for another huge year for the Nintendo Switch, and I think we have a lot of surprises coming for us later in the year. So that was pretty much it for this edition of Maple Syrup News. Once again, I'd like to know what your favorite story of today was. You can leave that down below in the comments. Also, as I said earlier, I'll be leaving affiliate links to all the physical copies of the games I mentioned from PlayAsia. If you do want to pick up those games, using those links would be greatly appreciated. And on the way out, don't forget that if you did like the content, consider hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel if you aren't already, and hitting that notification bell so you know when all my future content comes out. And as usual, I hope I'll see you in my next video.